In the spring of 1944, a finished four-engine heavy bomber rolled out the doors of a single building in Michigan every 63 minutes. Each one a whole airplane, a complete Liberator, 67 feet long, with a wingspan of 110 feet and 4 engines already hung, towed out into the daylight and lined up wingtip to wingtip on the grass. Over 3 days that April, 100 of them flew away. For years, that number has been the whole story. Ford built a bomber an hour. The politicians repeated it, the newsreel sold it, and almost every telling since has stopped right there at the boast. What almost nobody who repeats that number understands is that Willow Run was never a factory with machines set down inside it. The building was the machine. Every dimension of it was dictated by a single object, and that object was the bomber. The architect had drawn the outline of a Liberator, stretched it a mile long, and wrapped a building around it. And a mile from the door where those finished bombers rolled into the sun, the people who built them were sleeping in chicken coops. This was a plant that in a single month hired 2,900 workers and lost 3,100. So this is the story of the machine that built a bomber an hour, and the machine was the building itself. We are going to walk through it the way it was actually put together, from the mud it stood in, to the one tool that turned 250 hours of work into a single hour. And then we are going to count what it took out of the people who ran it. Because the bomber an hour was real. What it cost to get there is the part they left out. It was early in 1941, and Charles Sorensen was standing in a San Diego hotel room he had not planned to spend the night in. Sorensen was Ford's production chief, the man who had spent 30 years turning the moving assembly line into the thing that built the Model T, and then the whole modern world of cars. He had come to California to look at how airplanes were made. What he saw appalled him. At the Consolidated Aircraft Plant, bombers were being built the way cathedrals were built. Each aircraft sat in its own fixed cradle, much of the work happening out in the open California sun, and skilled men swarmed over one plane at a time, by hand, for weeks. There were never enough of those skilled men, and there never would be. To a car man, it looked like sculpture. The country had just been told it would need 50,000 aircraft a year, and the men who actually knew how to build airplanes were quietly certain it could not be done. So Sorensen did what Ford men did. That night, in the hotel, he sketched a factory on a sheet of paper, the opposite of everything he had just watched. He imagined the bomber moving, the way a car moved, pulled down a line past fixed stations, while the parts came to it. By morning, he had a rough drawing and a promise that would follow him for the rest of the war. One bomber an hour. Here is the problem with that promise. A car of that era had around 15,000 parts. A Liberator had roughly 1.25 million, and every one of them had to fit the next one to a tolerance no car had ever needed. To build that on a moving line, you did not start with the airplane. You started with a building unlike anything on Earth, and you handed the drawing to one man. Albert Kahn was the most important industrial architect in America, the designer of the great Ford plants, the man who had already built more factory floor than anyone alive. What he drew for Willow Run was staggering even to him. A single structure of more than 3.5 million square feet, laid out in a long L, with the final assembly line running better than a mile from one end to the other. Charles Lindbergh walked into it during the war and called it a Grand Canyon of the mechanized world. The most famous feature of that building, though, was a bend. The assembly line, running south, hits a right angle about 2/3 of the way down and turns 90 degrees. The story people love is that the turn was there for taxes, and that part is true. A straight line would have run the plant across the county boundary into a jurisdiction with higher taxes, so Ford bent the building to keep the whole thing inside Washtenaw County. But the turn was not only about money. Built into the floor at that corner was a set of enormous turntables, machines that could grip a half-finished bomber and swing it through the angle so the line never had to stop. That is the part of the story almost nobody tells. The machines hidden inside the famous tax bend. And under all of it was mud. The site was farmland and swamp, a creek called Willow Run, and not much else. 35 miles from Detroit, with no housing, no transit, and no workforce anywhere near it. Ground was broken in the spring of 1941, and the building went up at a pace that matched its madness. Crews poured concrete through the Michigan winter and threw up steel across ground that had been a soybean field a year earlier, racing to close a roof over more floor than any factory on Earth had ever held. Through that first brutal year, before a single bomber existed, tens of thousands of men were laboring in the open weather to build the thing that would build the airplanes. The people who would suffer most from this plant were suffering before it even had a roof, and we will come back to them, because their story is the one the boast buries. For now, hold on to one idea, because it is the hinge this whole thing turns on. When the last steel column went up and the roof closed over that mile of floor, the factory was not ready for production. The factory was production. What Kahn had built was far more than a shed to roll machines into. Every crane rail, every station, every foot of that bend existed to move one specific airplane through one specific sequence. We have just watched a machine the size of a small city get built. Now we switch it on. To understand what actually made a bomber an hour possible, you have to look at one part of the airplane, and it is not the part you would guess. It is the center wing, the thick box of structure in the middle of the aircraft that the fuselage sits on and the outer wings bolt to. It is the strongest, most complicated single assembly in the whole bomber, and at Consolidated, it was the bottleneck that made mass production look impossible. At the San Diego plant, each center wing was built in a temporary wooden jig, a kind of cradle that held the pieces in place while men riveted them together. When the wing was done, the jig was often scrapped or rebuilt, and the whole thing was slow, because everything depended on the skill of the men and the accuracy of a wooden frame that moved and warped. Building one center wing the Consolidated way took about 250 hours of labor. Ford looked at that and did something that sounds simple and was not. They built a permanent steel jig, a single massive fixture, machined to hold every piece of the center wing in exactly the right place, every time, so that the accuracy lived in the tool and not in the man. The wing was assembled inside it, then lifted out by an overhead crane and carried to the next station, while the jig immediately started the next one. 250 hours became one. That single change, moving the accuracy out of the man and into the tool, is the reason the entire moving line could exist at all. It is the moment airplane building stopped being sculpture. And then the center wing went somewhere that, even today, is hard to believe. Ford built a single multiple-function machine that performed 42 separate precision operations on that assembly, drilling and cutting and boring it to a tolerance of 2/10,000ths of an inch, and it did all 42 in 17 minutes. Think about that for a second. The most complex structural piece of a heavy bomber, finished to a fraction of the width of a human hair, in the time it takes to boil a pot of water. The historian Randy Houghton, who spent years on this plant, is the one who pinned that machine down, and it is the single clearest answer to the question of how a car company built airplanes an hour apart. That is one machine. There were 1,600 of them. To turn a Liberator into something a moving line could build, Ford needed a full year and a tool design group of roughly 1,000 people working around the clock. Consolidated's own drawings were nearly useless for mass production, sketches meant to guide skilled men building one airplane at a time. So Ford's engineers had to redraw the entire aircraft as manufacturing prints, generating close to 5 million square feet of blueprints in the process. Out of that came 1,600 machine tools and more than 11,000 fixtures, some of them 60 feet tall, and something on the order of 30,000 metal stamping dies, one for nearly every part that could be pressed instead of built by hand. A stamping die is a massive hardened steel mold that slams flat sheet metal into a finished shape in a single stroke, turning a job that once took a craftsman hours into one, a press does in seconds. Building 30,000 of them, each one unique, was a war effort all by itself. Roughly 900 people did nothing but design those dies, 7 days a week, night and day. Read that again, slowly. Before this plant could build its first bomber, an army of people had to build the tools that would build it. And once those tools were in place, the airplane moved. That is the whole idea Sorensen had scratched out in the hotel, made real at a scale that is hard to picture. The Liberator was pulled down that mile of floor through a sequence of about 28 major stations, growing at every one, a bare center wing at the start and a complete bomber at the end. Where the line hit the 90-degree bend, the turntables took hold, gripped the half-built aircraft, and rotated it through the corner so the flow never stopped. Overhead, cranes lifted whole subassemblies from one part of the building and set them down exactly where the line needed them. Nothing sat still, and nothing was carried by hand that a machine could move. At its height, the plant ran day and night, 2 shifts around the clock, one of the largest industrial operations ever gathered under a single roof. And they did not just copy the airplane, they redesigned it to be manufactured. The Liberator's landing gear pivot, the joint that swings the main gear up and down, arrived from Consolidated as a fussy assembly of about half a dozen steel pieces, 2 large tubes, and something like 100 welds that all had to be X-rayed to prove they had not cracked. Ford threw it out and recast it as 3 large castings. Where Consolidated riveted, Ford spot-welded wherever the structure would allow it, and in one single component, the shell supporting the rear gun turret, a redesign erased more than 7,000 rivets. Every one of those changes was a small war between the men who designed airplanes and the men who built cars, and on that assembly line, the car men usually won. And consider what was being fed into that line. A single Liberator was held together by more than 360,000 rivets in 550 different sizes, wrapped around 4 engines that Ford did not even build. The 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engines came from Buick, one war-converted car company feeding another. And not every finished bomber could be flown out, so alongside the complete aircraft, shipped nearly 1,900 more as knockdown kits, whole airplanes broken into crates and sent to plants in Fort Worth and Tulsa to be bolted back together there. This was manufacturing on a scale that had no precedent anywhere. So by the middle of 1942, Ford had the building, the jigs, the dies, and the line. And here is the part the boast never mentions. It did not work. For a while, on paper, Willow Run looked like the arsenal of democracy made real. The reality on the floor was something else. In all of 1942, the entire plant produced 56 aircraft. 56, from a factory built to make one an hour. The engineering changes never stopped coming from the military, and every change meant recutting dies and rebuilding fixtures that had cost a fortune and months to make. The workforce was raw and constantly turning over. In Washington, a Senate committee led by a then obscure senator named Harry Truman began investigating the plant as a symbol of everything going wrong with war production. The critics had a nickname for the place, and it followed Ford everywhere. They called it, "Will it run?" And for most of that first year, the honest answer was no. The same relentless system that would eventually produce a bomber an hour was, in that moment, grinding up everything fed into it. And what it was hungriest for was people. Because the machine in Michigan had a problem no jig could solve. Nobody could live near it. Remember the mud? Willow Run sat 35 miles from Detroit, dropped into farmland that had housed a few hundred people, and it needed tens of thousands. At its peak, in the summer of 1943, more than 42,000 people worked there. Drawn from all 48 states, but above all out of the hills of Appalachia and the rural South. Whole families pulling up stakes from Kentucky and Tennessee and the West Virginia coal country to chase a wage on the bomber line. The town of Ypsilanti nearby had a pre-war population of around 12,000, and the plant needed roughly 3 times that many bodies. There was simply nowhere for them to go. So they improvised, and the improvising was grim. Workers threw up shacks of tar paper in the open fields, and trailer camps sprawled across the mud without proper water or sewers. Families slept in chicken coops, in tents, in converted sheds, anywhere with a roof. And a practice took hold, with a name that tells you everything: hot bedding, where a bed never got cold because one worker climbed into it as another climbed out to go to the line. The same mattress rented in shifts around the clock. People who built the most advanced aircraft in the world went home to conditions a farmer would not keep animals in. The government tried to catch up. It built dormitories, a complex called Willow Lodge, with something like 3,000 single beds, opened in early 1943, and a settlement of family units called Willow Run Village, around 2,500 of them, opened that summer. By 1944, the housing there held close to 9,000 units and something over 18,000 people. It was never enough, and it was never fast enough, and the turnover it caused is the real reason that plant stumbled for so long. In 1 month, remember, Ford hired 2,900 people and lost 3,100. Early in 1943, the plant was taking on around 1,800 workers a month, while roughly 1,600 walked out the door. You cannot build an airplane an hour when the people who know how keep leaving before they have learned. And getting to the line at all was its own ordeal. The plant was so far from the city, with no transit built for it, that the federal government had to lay down a brand new highway just to move workers to the door. That road, the Willow Run Expressway, poured with Ford steel and cement and opened in the fall of 1942, later became part of what we now call Interstate 94. Even with the highway, moving that many bodies took a fleet of buses running dozens of public trips and well over 100 private ones every single day, hauling workers in from as far as Detroit and back out again around the clock. The commute was so central to life at the plant that it worked its way into the sociology of the place, and a study published years later, in 1952, by 2 researchers named Lowell Carr and James Sturmer, recorded worker families in their own words, describing a way of life the boast never mentions. If you are getting something out of how this plant was actually built, and not just the version you have heard. Take a second and subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of story we dig into every week. Now let us get to the people the assembly line was actually built on. By 1943, with the men going off to war, the workforce that made the bomber an hour was increasingly not men at all. About 1 in 3 of the assembly workers at Willow Run were women. At the peak, more than 15,000 women worked that line, and they were paid the same 85 cents an hour the men were paid, which for the time was remarkable. These were the women the country would later flatten into a single poster, but the real ones were riveters and inspectors and crane operators. Some of them had the job of crawling bodily into the wings of the bomber, into spaces barely wide enough to turn around in, to run and connect the electrical wiring by feel. And one of them gave the poster its name. Rose Will Monroe was a young widow from Pulaski County, Kentucky, who came north looking for work after her husband died, and ended up riveting Liberators at Willow Run. When the actor Walter Pidgeon came through the plant to film a promotional reel to sell war bonds, he needed a real riveter named Rose for the part, and there she was, already doing the job. She became a face of Rosie the Riveter, though the honest history is that there were several women behind that image across the country, and no single one of them owns it. But Monroe was real. She was there, and she was one of thousands. There is a detail about who built these bombers that is almost never told, and it is one of the strangest in the whole war. The center wing and the wingtips of a Liberator are cramped, tight spaces full of structure, hard for a full-sized adult to climb inside and rivet. So Ford recruited little people, roughly 10 of them, some from circuses and some from Hollywood, specifically because they could fit inside the wing to buck rivets and set the fuel cells where larger workers could not reach. At a bar in Ypsilanti, the story goes, a doorknob was lowered so they could reach it. It is a small human thing, and it tells you how total this effort was, that a car company solved a structural access problem by hiring people from a circus. That was the story the public was allowed to see. The united home front, everyone pulling together. Behind the scenes, the fight over who was allowed to pull was uglier. Willow Run employed thousands of white women, but at first it hired essentially no black women at all, and the housing being built around it was drawn straight down the color line. And this became one of the most important civil rights battles of the home front, though you will almost never hear it attached to the bomber story. The Union, the United Auto Workers, and its leader Walter Reuther pushed hard for something radical. They wanted a permanent, planned, integrated town at Bomber City, real housing where black and white war workers would live together. Henry Ford himself opposed the communal plan, and it collapsed into temporary, segregated housing instead. It got worse than that. The authorities overseeing war housing in the region ruled, in plain language, that to qualify for public war housing, you had to be either white or black, and the segregated projects reflected it. For a long time, Ford's own management resisted putting black women on the assembly line at all, and when integrated housing was refused, a separate development called Park Ridge Homes, 80 units, was built in 1943 for African American workers, designed by Hilliard Robinson, one of the most respected black architects in the country. The fight did not stay quiet. A local minister named Charles Simmons picketed Ford's hiring offices and the segregated housing, and traveled to Washington alongside the attorney Thurgood Marshall, the man who would one day sit on the Supreme Court, to press the case. All of it played out against Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802, the federal ban on discrimination in defense work, an order that existed on paper while the reality at places like Willow Run lagged years behind it. The bomber, an hour, and this fight were happening in the same fields, at the same time, and only one of them made it into the newsreels. And what did all of it cost in blood? This is where the record gets careful, and we are going to be careful with it too. The plant ran its own hospital, with 8 doctors and 40 nurses, and it treated an enormous number of cases over the war. The institution that keeps this history states that Willow Run recorded no fatality on the line during its service. Hold that phrasing exactly as it is. No recorded fatality is not the same sentence as nobody was ever hurt, and the honest version of this story respects the difference. In a plant this size, running this hard, with this many injuries passing through that hospital. What we can say for certain is that the human cost of Willow Run was measured less in a body count on the floor and more in the lives ground down around it. The families in the chicken coops, the workers who came and broke and left. By the spring of 1944, the machine had finally learned to run. Several things had changed at once. The endless engineering changes from the military had slowed as the design of the airplane finally settled, which meant the dies and fixtures could stop being torn up and recut every few weeks. The government housing had at last caught up enough to hold a workforce in place long enough to actually train it, and the plant's management had finally steadied itself after a brutal shakeout at the top. The turnover eased, the workforce settled, and the line at last did the thing it had promised. That April, in 2 9-hour shifts, 6 days a week, Willow Run built 453 aircraft in 468 hours. That is the bomber an hour, made real at last, more than a year after the boast. And it is worth being precise about what that phrase actually meant, because people have argued about it ever since. It never meant that a bare pile of aluminum went in one end, and a finished bomber came out the other 63 minutes later. A single Liberator took far longer than an hour to build. What it meant was that the line was so long and so full, with hundreds of aircraft strung out along that mile at every stage of completion, that a finished one rolled off the end roughly every hour, even though building any single airplane still took far longer. The 1000th Liberator had rolled out the previous November. Now they were coming so fast, the plant could barely park them. By the time the line shut down, Willow Run had built 8,685 complete Liberators, plus around 1,900 more shipped out as those knockdown kits. That was close to half of every Liberator the United States built in the entire war, out of one building. The last one came off the line on the 28th of June, 1945. And with that, the most important thing to understand about this factory is that its entire purpose had an expiration date built into it, and the date was almost here. Before we get to what happened to the building, we owe you the truth about a few things the boast gets wrong, because this is where most tellings quietly fudge the record. Start with the name on it. This is remembered as Henry Ford's plant, and it was not really his doing. The men who actually drove Willow Run were his son, Edsel Ford, and the production chief Sorensen. Edsel was the one who committed Ford to the bomber program and pushed it forward. And Edsel died in May of 1943, in the middle of the plant's worst struggles, worn down and only 49 years old. Leadership passed to a Ford executive named Meade Bricker, while Harry Bennett ran the plant's harsh internal policing. The old man whose name the plant carries was largely out of it. His son, who is barely remembered, carried the thing and did not live to see it work. Then there is the airplane itself. The Liberator was built in greater numbers than any other American combat aircraft of the war, and Willow Run built the largest share of them. But it was not the plane the crews loved. It flew farther, and carried more than the more famous B-17. But it was harder to fly, less forgiving of battle damage, and it had a reputation among air crews for not bringing people home the way the 17 did. General Henry Arnold, who ran the Army Air Forces, once told Lindbergh that combat squadrons plainly preferred the 17, because when they sent 17s out, most of them came back. But the Liberator went everywhere the war needed range. It flew the long, punishing daylight raids over Europe, including the low-level attack on the oil refineries at Ploesti. It carried the bombing war across the enormous distances of the Pacific, and it hunted submarines far out over the Atlantic, precisely because so many were built, and they could fly so far. And of all the tens of thousands of Liberators built across the country, the vast majority were lost in combat, worn out, or scrapped the instant the war ended. Only around 13 complete airframes survive anywhere on Earth today. Willow Run's miracle was one of quantity. The quality of the thing it built, and how long any of it lasted, is a more complicated story than the boast allows. So the war ends, and now we come to the part almost no telling bothers with, the 60 years after the miracle. Ford did not want the plant. It had been built and operated for the government, and when peace came, Ford walked away from its option to buy it. In 1946, the automaker Kaiser Frazer took it over for around $15 million and built cars there, along with 71 military transport aircraft. Then, after a fire destroyed a General Motors transmission plant in 1953, General Motors took Willow Run over to build its hydromatic automatic transmissions, and in one of the small echoes of the war effort, the plant was back in production only 9 weeks after that fire. For decades after, it built transmissions and cars. The Corvair and the Nova among them. The great arsenal of democracy quietly turned into an ordinary parts plant. And in 2010, in the wreckage of General Motors' bankruptcy, it closed for good, and the mile-long building where a bomber had once rolled out every hour was handed to a trust to be cleaned up and torn down. And it very nearly all disappeared. Between 2013 and 2014, the demolition crews moved in and took down the great structure, 5 million square feet of it by then, piece by piece. It looked like the whole thing would end as scrap and an empty field. But a group tied to a local aviation museum, the Yankee Air Museum, launched a desperate race to save just a piece of it, and raised something close to $8 million against a ticking clock to buy a single fragment of the plant, about 144,000 square feet, the finishing end, the very stretch of floor where the completed bombers had rolled out to the tarmac. They closed the deal in 2014, reopened in the historic building in 2017, and today it is the Michigan Flight Museum, renamed as recently as 2024. The rest of the ground did not go back to farmland. Most of the old site became a testing ground for self-driving cars, a place called the American Center for Mobility, where engineers now run autonomous vehicles across the same acres where a bomber once rolled out every hour. The site that helped win one war became a laboratory for the next century of the machines it was built to make. So walk back out to where we started, to that door and that grass, where a finished bomber appeared every 63 minutes, and 100 of them flew off in 3 days. Almost all of it is gone now. The mile of floor, the turntables, the bend that beat the taxman, cut up and hauled away. What survived is that one saved slice of the finishing end, and something else, out in the world. Of those 13 Liberators left anywhere on Earth, 4 were built in that building. The machine that was a mile long is mostly a memory now, but 4 of the airplanes it built are still here, And every one of them was carried out that door by the people we spent this whole story trying to remember.